Here is Sailor California, a teal ink. Let's jump straight to the end with my opinion on this ink.
The paper I'm using here is a Maruman Mnemosyne Notebook.
It's a very dark teal that has a bit of a blue lean given the right light, but never a blue ink. There is some tone variation by pen, though generally it is kind of close. In general, it does shade, and when it does it well. On non-fountain pen friendly paper, I think it looks as good and generally is well behaved. Now, teal and turquoise inks usually aren't my thing, and yet I have loved my time with this ink and would love to have a bottle or 3 of it. All of the writing samples are done with a Platinum 3776 with a soft fine nib that writes rather dry, a Hero 7035 with a fine nib that writes wet, a Visconti Van Gogh with a medium nib and an average flow, a Lamy All-Star with a broad nib that writes average.
The pen for today is a Noodler's Ahab.
Now that we know my opinion on this ink, let's see how I got there with the first writing sample done on Clairfontaine. Looking at the soft fine nib, we get the lightest tone that we're gonna get. Still very much a beautiful teal with no feather, no spread. Shading, I just bumped the mic, sorry. It does shade without any kind of a problem, and it does it very regularly. Nothing really bad. If we look at nothing on this third line, the N is a bit darker than the O. The TH darken up a little bit. The I just a little bit lighter. The N darker, much darker. The G a nice mid-tone to end things. Looking at the wet fine nib, it is a whole lot darker than it was with the soft fine. It does not feather and it does not spread. It does shade, though not as standout as it was with the soft fine. The shading is very gentle and not huge in what's happening here with this paper. You can only see it ever so slightly with things like green on the third line, where the GRE are darker than the last EN that lighten just a little bit. Now, Shores next to that shows it just a little bit more, where the H is by far the darkest letter there. Looking at the medium nib, it is just a little bit lighter than it was with the wet fine. It does not feather and it does not spread. It does shade very well. I mean, if you take a look at Hope to Rebuild on the first line, Hope, the H is very dark. The O lightens up a little bit. The PE at the end, quite a bit darker. 2 is very funny because it's during the downstroke of the T, it's lighter. It's at the bottom of the T, it gets fairly dark, but into the O is much lighter than it was in the T. In Rebuild, the R is a nice mid-tone. The E becomes very dark. The BUI, lighter again. And the LD darken just a little bit at the end. Looking at the broad nib, it is lighter than it was with the medium nib. It does not feather and it does not spread. It does shade, not a ton, but it is there a little bit. It's just not shouting at you. When you look at Shouted on the first line, where the S is lighter than the H, the OU go to a nice mid-tone for what's here, carrying that into the T, but the E becomes just a little bit darker, holding on to that into the D, but it's the downstroke of the D at the end that gets much darker. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting. Like most inks, this one comes in a bottle. This is how the Pilot Custom 823 fits. And here is the Pelican M1000. Here is the ink level when you can no longer fill a Lamy Safari. There is approximately 7 milliliters of ink left. The next writing sample is done in a Portage Reporter's Notebook. Looking at the soft fine nib, it is the same tone as the Clairfontaine. It does not feather and it does not spread. It shades not as well as it did on the Clairfontaine, but you can definitely see it's there. It's echoes of its former self, looking at Echoed on the fourth line, where it only gets darker during the hump of the H and the downstroke of the D. Looking at the wet fine nib, it is a whole lot darker than it was with the soft fine. Just as dark as it was on the Clairfontaine. It does not feather and it does not spread. It does shade quite a bit better than it did on the Clairfontaine. Now, I said it's the same tone because it's showing the same tones, though it's showing more of the mid-tones and going back and forth between the darker tones. Take a look at last on the first line, where the L and T, the bookends of this word, if you will, are darker than the as in the middle. Looking at the medium nib, it is lighter than it was with the wet fine, just a little lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. It does not feather and it does not spread. It does shade, though not as well as it did on the Clairfontaine. It's there. I mean, you have to look close, like close on the first line, where it's only the SE at the end that are darker. In behind, the D at the end, bringing up its behind, is darker than the rest of the word. Looking at the broad nib, it is the same tone as the medium, just a little bit lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. It does not feather and it does not spread. It does shade about as well as it did on the Clairfontaine, which wasn't particularly well. I mean, you can see in imperishable on the third line, the E at the end is darker than the rest of the word, as is the downstroke of that P, but not a whole lot. Worthy on the second line, it's the Y that becomes darker. Really, you only get tiny little spots that show some shading. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding, no ghosting, and can easily continue our notes back here.
There's a lot to learn by doing multiple chromatographies. The one on the left is immediately put into water for 10 to 15 seconds. The one on the right, marked with a D, is let dry for 10 minutes before putting into water. The next writing sample is done on a national brand Steno notebook.
Looking at the soft fine nib, it is darker than it was on the Clairfontaine. It does not feather and it does not spread. It does shade, I think, better than it did on the Clairfontaine, or at least it is much more noticeable. Take a look at spoke very loud on the second line, where the SP is darker than the O. The KE become very dark again. Very is a nice mid-tone until you get to the Y in that downstroke. It darkens up there, and loud has the bookend LD that are darker than the OU in the middle. Looking at the wet fine nib, it is a whole lot darker than it was with the soft fine, just as dark as it was on the Clairfontaine. It does not feather, it does not spread, it does not shade. It just is a very nice tone. Really not becoming a blue, which there's that slight blue undertone, but it is not becoming it. It is being a very dark teal and doing a great job of it. Looking at the wet fine nib, it is just as dark as it was with the wet fine, darker than it was on the Clairfontaine. It does not feather, it does not spread, it does shade almost as well, maybe, as it did on the Clairfontaine. I don't know. Songs on the first line, the GS do become a little bit darker than the rest of the word. Played on the second line, the P is quite a bit darker than the LAY. It's during that Y it becomes darker and keeps it through the ed at the end. Looking at the broad nib, it is just a little bit lighter than it was with the medium, darker than it was on the Clairfontaine. It doesn't feather, doesn't spread. It does shade in that we often get a darker very end of the word, like the D of and on the second line, the N of and on the second line. Sometimes your punctuation, like that exclamation point, might be a bit darker, but for the most part, we're getting a fairly consistent tone. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding, no ghosting, and could continue our notes back here.
Resistance tests are done to see how this ink can be expected to perform on the page, and more importantly, how hard it may be to clean from your pen. The smear is allowed to dry for 3 days before testing it. The highlighter is on the top left, pen flush is on the top right, 1/3 bleach solution is on the bottom left, and water is on the bottom right. The next writing sample is done in a Rhodia notebook.
Looking at the soft fine nib, it is the same tone as the Clairfontaine. It does not feather and it does not spread. It does shade just as well as it did on the Clairfontaine. However, we're here to take a look at this quad rule. I think it stands out without any kind of a problem, not as a darkness issue. The color is entirely different, so it stands out well against the quad rule, making it good for students to use in that note-taking situation. Looking at the wet fine nib, it is a whole lot darker than it was with the soft fine, the same tone as the Clairfontaine. It does not feather and it does not spread. It does shade. There's moments, like moment on the first line, where the E and T are certainly darker than the rest of the word, but the right next to it is a much darker word. Where people, it's the P and the pull at the end that are darker than the EO in the middle. So yeah, I guess it is shading fairly decently here. Looking at the medium nib, it is just a little bit lighter than it was with the wet fine, the same tone as the Clairfontaine. It does not feather, does not spread. It does shade, though not as well as it did on the Clairfontaine. I'm not bitter about this when I say this, looking at bitter on the first line, where the BR are lighter than the TT in the middle. The E lightens up a little bit, but that R at the end does become darker. Looking at the broad nib, it is lighter than it was with the medium nib. Same tone as the Clairfontaine. It does not feather and it does not spread. It only has a light peppering that shows up of shading from time to time, though not a ton, like the on the second line, where the E at the end certainly is darker than the rest of the word, and that's about what you can expect, is the occasional one letter of darker. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding, no ghosting, and can easily continue our notes. Always makes me happy.
With over 1,000 inks reviewed, let's take a look at some color comparables.
Here is Ackerman, their number 24. Here is Monteverde, California Teal. Here is Pilot Kujaku or Peacock. Here is Sailor Yamadori.
The next writing sample is done in a composition lab notebook.
Looking at the soft fine nib, it is the same tone as the Clairfontaine, just a little bit flatter version of that same tone. Now, it does not feather and it does not spread. It does shade, not huge, but it's not going to make me unhappy as we look at unhappy on the second line, where the un is lighter than the H, which becomes quite a bit darker. The AP lighten up a little bit. That second P does get a little bit darker, lightening up a little bit with the Y at the end. Looking at the wet fine nib, it is darker than it was with the soft fine, quite a bit lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. It does not feather, it does not spread, it barely shades when it shades, or so I thought, looking at thought on the first line, where the TH is darker than the OU. It's during the G that it darkens up into the HT at the end, staying dark. Looking at the medium nib, it is the same tone as the wet fine, lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. It does not feather and it does not spread. It does shade, I think, a little better than it did on this paper with that wet fine. I mean, take a look at filled with golden on the second line. The FI are a tiny bit darker than the LL. The ED at the end do become quite a bit darker. In width, it's the WI that are lighter, the TH darken up a little bit. And on golden, gold is lighter than the N at the end. That's N as in EN. Looking at the broad nib, it is lighter than it was with the medium, lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. It does not feather, it does not spread. It does have the occasional just moment of shading, not something you should really go looking for or expecting a ton here. I mean, if you look at weighty on the second line, the dot of the I, the very top of the H and the Y are a tiny bit darker, but that is most of the shading that you're going to see here. Looking at the back of the page, every student's going to be happy that they can continue their notes back here because there's no bleeding and no ghosting.
While it's nice to see ink in the same color family, I prefer to see ink to complement the color on the page.
Here is Robert Oster Peach. Here is Sailor Shigor. Here is Diatramentis Velvet Black Gold. Here is Diamine Matador.
The last writing sample is done on 20-pound copy paper.
Looking at the soft fine nib, it is the same tone as the Clairfontaine. Shocker. Now it does feather a little bit, it does spread a little bit, not a big deal. Sure, it does shade. You can see it in North, especially on the first line. Most noticeably is, as long as it's, when it's shading, when it's getting darker, it's feathering and spreading more. So it's something to keep in mind. Now, is this usable? I think this is usable in what we're getting here. I would use it, and I could be okay with it. Looking at the wet fine nib, it is a whole lot darker than it was with the soft fine, lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. It does feather, it does spread, it doesn't shade, it does pass as usable on this paper, despite the fact that I was really expecting going into it for this to become a bit of a problem, and that was based on what I saw when it's shaded with the soft fine, but it holds up to being usable on 20-pound copy paper. Looking at the medium nib, it is the same tone as the wet fine, lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. It does feather and it does spread, it does not shade. It does perform better than it did with the wet fine nib. So it's just the wet nib that's going to make it have a little bit of a problem. The feathering and the spread are well under control in that serviceable range that you could use them, and it's not the end of the world. Looking at the broad nib, it is just a little bit lighter than it was with the medium, lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. It does feather and it does spread. It has the least feathering, least spread of all of the writing that are on this paper. It's got absolutely no shading going on. I think this is the best version of what I've seen with this ink on this paper, and absolutely amazing. I kind of wish I was using a Lamy fine to see how well this would have done. Looking at the back of the page, this is actually rather impressive. Sure, the ink gets very deep into the page, but what I'm really impressed with is it did much better with the wet fine than I had expected. Better there, I think, than it did with any of the others. Now, nothing bled through touching the page underneath, but, I don't think I would take notes back here, but I don't think what I'm seeing is the end of the world. I think this is fairly good and under control considering what we're writing on.
So what nib and pen do I think are going to give the best writing experience with this ink?
The paper I'm using here is yellow Rhodia paper.
The dry writing soft fine gives the lightest tone and shades well. Now the wet fine is the darkest and it shades the least. The medium is just a tiny bit lighter than it was with the wet fine, and I think it shades the best or better than the wet fine. Now the broad is noticeably lighter than the medium, yet still darker than the soft fine. But it shades the least, yet shows off the color really well. Now I've enjoyed this a bunch from the Ahab, which I use the most during the day, and the beautiful dark teal really stands out, draws attention on the page, which puts me onto thinking of a wet pen regardless of the nib size. But I don't think you could really go wrong with any pen. just that using a wet pen would be best.
I hope you got something out of this video, and thanks for watching. I want to let you know that the best way you can support this or any channel is to let retailers know where you heard of something if you go to buy.